When the first B-17 flying fortresses appeared over Germany in 1942, Luftwaffe pilots attacked confidently, expecting easy victories against lumbering American bombers. Then they discovered something that would haunt them for the rest of the war. The B-17 refused to die. Fortresses returned to England with engines shot out, tails nearly severed, fuselages riddled with hundreds of holes, and still flying. German fighters that got too close encountered 13.50 caliber machine guns that shredded attackers. The B-17 wasn't just a bomber, it was an airborne fortress that absorbed punishment and fought back, breaking the Luftwaffe through relentless attrition. On August 17, 1943, 376 B-17s launched a dual raid against Regensburg and Schweinfurt, targets deep in Germany beyond fighter escort range. The mission plan assumed tight formations, and defensive firepower would protect bombers without fighter cover. The assumption proved catastrophically wrong, as Luftwaffe fighters attacked in waves throughout the mission, shooting down 60 bombers and damaging 168 others. Losses so severe that crews called it Black Thursday, and military planners questioned whether daylight bombing could continue, with loss rates exceeding 16%, meaning bomber crews statistically couldn't survive the required 25 mission combat tours. The second Schweinfurt raid on October 14, 1943, proved even worse. Of 291 B-17s dispatched, 60 were shot down, and 138 returned damaged. German fighters exploited the gap between P-47 escort range and target distance, waiting until American fighters turned back before launching coordinated attacks that overwhelmed bomber defensive fire through sheer numbers, demonstrating that fortresses without escort were vulnerable regardless of defensive armament, and forcing temporary suspension of deep penetration raids until long-range escorts became available. The massacres nearly killed the daylight bombing strategy that American air power doctrine depended upon. British advocates of night bombing pointed to Schweinfurt as proof that unescorted daylight raids were unsustainable. 8th Air Force Commander General Ira Eaker faced pressure to abandon daylight operations entirely and adopt RAF night bombing tactics, which would have represented strategic defeat for American air power theory that promised precision bombing would win wars through systematic destruction of enemy industrial capacity rather than area attacks on cities. Yet bomber crews who survived Schweinfurt reported something that strategists found encouraging despite horrific losses. B-17s absorbed incredible damage and kept flying. Aircraft returned with engines destroyed, control surfaces shot away, and fuselages resembling Swiss cheese. Damage that should have been fatal but wasn't, suggesting that with proper fighter escort, the flying fortress could survive long enough to accomplish its strategic mission. But the slaughter revealed something unexpected about B-17 durability. B-17 survival stories became legendary among both American crews and German pilots who couldn't understand how aircraft absorbed such punishment and continued flying. One fortress returned to England with over 200 flak and bullet holes, the nose section nearly destroyed, and hydraulic systems completely failed. Yet it landed safely. Another returned on 2 engines with the entire tailgunner position shot away and stabilizer hanging by cables. The pilot maintaining control through strength and trim tabs alone for a 3-hour flight across the English Channel, demonstrating structural resilience that German bomber designs couldn't match. The B-17's rugged construction centered on its deep fuselage structure that distributed stress across multiple load paths. Unlike aircraft with single main spar designs, the Flying Fortress used multiple structural members that provided redundancy. A single spar failure wouldn't cause catastrophic structural collapse, meaning battle damage that would destroy other bombers merely degraded B-17 performance without preventing flight, and the aircraft's ability to fly on two engines, or even one in desperate circumstances, gave crews survival chances that German bomber crews never enjoyed. The Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines proved remarkably reliable and resistant to battle damage. Their radial configuration meant one cylinder could be destroyed without total engine failure. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fire from tracer rounds that ignited unprotected tanks in earlier aircraft, and the distributed fuel system meant punctures in one tank didn't prevent access to others, giving B-17s fuel redundancy that allowed them to return from missions that would have left other bombers ditching in the North Sea. Memphis Belle became the most famous fortress, completing 25 combat missions, the required tour length, and returning to the United States for warbond tours. The aircraft and crew became symbols of B-17 survivability, featuring in a 1944 documentary that showed American audiences how their bombers absorbed punishment while striking back at Germany, providing propaganda value that justified continued daylight bombing despite horrific casualties. Yet durability meant nothing without the firepower to fight back. Speaking of, if you're enjoying these untold aviation stories, hit that subscribe button so you never miss the incredible tales of the aircraft that shaped history. The B-17G model bristled with 13.50 caliber Browning machine guns positioned to create overlapping fields of fire covering every approach angle. 2 guns in the chin turret, 2 in the top turret, 2 in the ball turret beneath the fuselage, 2 in the tail, and single guns in the waist positions, radio room, and cheek positions. This concentration of defensive firepower transformed individual bombers into dangerous targets. But the real defensive power came from formation tactics, where dozens of fortresses created interlocking fields of fire that German fighters had to penetrate, with any attacking aircraft potentially facing fire from multiple bombers simultaneously. The combat box formation, tight groupings of 18 to 21 bombers flying in staggered altitudes, maximized mutual defensive fire while maintaining bombing accuracy. Luftwaffe pilots attacking the formation faced a wall of 50 caliber fire from potentially 250-plus machine guns, making approach runs through this defensive gauntlet extremely dangerous, with hit probabilities increasing dramatically as fighters closed to effective firing range where bomber gunners could concentrate fire on individual targets. The 50 caliber Browning proved ideal for defensive armament, combining hitting power sufficient to destroy attacking fighters with ammunition capacity for sustained engagement. Unlike 20mm cannons that carried limited ammunition, each gun position could carry 500 to 1,000 rounds, allowing gunners to engage multiple targets throughout extended missions. And the weapon's reliability at high altitude, where cold temperatures caused cannon failures, gave B-17 gunners consistent firepower regardless of operating conditions. German fighter pilots learned to respect formation defensive fire through painful experience. Luftwaffe loss records show hundreds of fighters destroyed by bomber defensive guns. Pilots described attacking fortress formations as flying through a steel curtain where tracers from dozens of guns converged on approach paths, forcing split-second timing to fire and break away before concentrated defensive fire destroyed attacking aircraft. And many German pilots refused to press attacks against well-formed bomber boxes, breaking off to seek stragglers with degraded defensive capability. German fighters learned to fear the formations, but found a deadly weakness. Luftwaffe tacticians recognized that B-17 defensive armament concentrated firepower to the sides and rear, leaving the nose comparatively weak with only 2.50 caliber guns in early models. Frontal attacks exploited this vulnerability by approaching head-on at closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, giving bomber gunners perhaps 2 seconds of firing opportunity before fighters flashed past, and the high closing rate made accurate defensive fire nearly impossible while giving German pilots large target profiles for their cannon fire. Specialized Sturmgruppen units equipped with heavily armed and armored FW-190s perfected frontal attack tactics. These assault fighters carried 30mm cannons and additional armor protection, accepting reduced performance for firepower sufficient to destroy B-17s with single bursts. Sturmgruppen pilots closed to point-blank range, sometimes within 100 yards, before firing devastating salvos that could shred bomber cockpits and forward fuselages, accepting that some pilots would be killed by collision or defensive fire in exchange for guaranteed bomber kills at such close range. The American response came through rapid field modifications. Engineers added the chin turret with 2.50 caliber guns specifically to counter frontal attacks, giving B-17Gs dedicated forward-firing defensive armament. The modification transformed frontal approaches from safe attack angles into dangerous gauntlets where German pilots faced concentrated fire before reaching effective weapon range, forcing Luftwaffe tacticians to develop new approaches or accept higher casualties, and demonstrating how American industrial capacity could identify and counter tactical innovations within months. Formation tactics evolved to counter frontal attacks through defensive positioning. Lead aircraft with chin turrets positioned to provide maximum forward defensive fire, while trailing aircraft covered side and rear approaches. The adaptive tactics technology cycle between Luftwaffe attack innovation and American defensive response created escalating lethality, where both bombers and fighters faced increasing danger. But American industrial capacity to replace losses ultimately favored the attackers who could sustain attrition that German pilot training systems couldn't match. Even as tactics evolved, one mission would prove the B-17's true value. Operation Argument, nicknamed Big Week, launched in February 1944 with unprecedented intensity. Over 6 days, the 8th Air Force dispatched 3,800 bomber sorties against German aircraft production facilities. The strategic objective was destroying Luftwaffe manufacturing capacity and forcing defensive fighters into attrition battles they couldn't win, with B-17s serving as both strike weapons, destroying factories, and bait drawing German fighters into combat, where escorting P-51 Mustangs could destroy them, creating dual-purpose missions where bomber losses were tactically acceptable if they enabled fighter victories. The campaign succeeded through brutal mathematics rather than tactical elegance. American bombers destroyed or heavily damaged German aircraft factories at Regensburg, Leipzig, and Gotha, while escorting fighters shot down over 500 Luftwaffe aircraft. The 8th Air Force lost 226 bombers and 28 fighters during Big Week. Catastrophic by earlier standards, but sustainable given American production rates that replaced losses within weeks, while German aircraft production never recovered from the systematic destruction of irreplaceable machine tools, skilled workers, and manufacturing facilities. The strategic impact exceeded physical damage to factories. Luftwaffe fighter units lost 18% of their pilots during Big Week, veterans with years of combat experience who couldn't be replaced. The Luftwaffe had pilots, but increasingly they were inexperienced replacements with minimal training, flying against veteran American crews in superior aircraft, reversing the experience advantage Germany had enjoyed early in the war, and creating a death spiral where replacement pilots died before gaining combat proficiency. Big Week validated the B-17's strategic role as the centerpiece of daylight bombing doctrine. The Flying Fortress served as the platform delivering strategic devastation while absorbing punishment that would have destroyed less rugged aircraft. By demonstrating that systematic bombing campaigns with acceptable losses could destroy enemy war production, the B-17 proved American air power theory correct and forced Germany into defensive attrition warfare they couldn't sustain, making D-Day possible by establishing air superiority before the invasion launched. Strategic success came at a price measured in thousands of young lives. Behind the strategic statistics and tactical analysis were human beings, mostly in their early 20s, who faced death on every mission. 8th Air Force bomber crews suffered 26,000 killed and 28,000 wounded from 1942 to 1945. The casualty rate exceeded 50% for crews serving before 1942 P-51 escorts arrived, meaning statistically half of bomber crewmen would be killed or severely wounded before completing 25 mission combat tours, creating grim mathematics where crews calculated their survival odds and flew, knowing they probably wouldn't make it home. The psychological toll was devastating. Crews watched neighboring aircraft explode in mid-air, saw friends die in burning bombers falling from formation, and returned to empty bunks where squadron mates had slept the previous night. Frostbite at 25,000 feet, flak concussions, oxygen deprivation, and the constant thunder of engines and gunfire created physical and mental exhaustion that accumulated across missions, and many crews developed what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder but was then dismissed as lack of moral fiber, requiring continued combat duty. The Medal of Honor awards to B-17 crewmen illustrated the courage required for fortress warfare. Bombardier John C. Morgan flew an entire mission while unconscious pilots slumped on controls, maintaining formation through strength alone. Ball turret gunner Alan McGee fell 22,000 feet after his fortress exploded, crashed through a train station roof, and survived, one of dozens of miraculous survival stories that provided hope to crews facing near-certain death over Germany. Despite horrific casualties, bomber crews continued flying because they understood the strategic necessity. Every mission destroyed German war production, forced Luftwaffe into defensive battles, and brought victory closer. The survivors recognized their sacrifice enabled Allied victory, destroyed Nazi Germany's ability to wage war, and validated the strategic bombing doctrine that would define American military power for generations, making their losses meaningful even when individual missions seemed futile. The survivors' sacrifices enabled what came next. Subscribe now to discover more incredible stories about the machines and men who changed the course of history. The B-17 Flying Fortress became the iconic symbol of American strategic bombing doctrine that dominated U.S. military thinking throughout the Cold War. The aircraft validated the theory that precision daylight bombing could destroy enemy war-making capacity, proving that strategic air power could win wars through systematic targeting of industrial infrastructure rather than grinding attrition on battlefields. And this validation influenced strategic air command doctrine that assumed nuclear-armed bombers could deter Soviet aggression through threat of devastating retaliation. The cultural legacy matched the military impact. Hollywood films, documentaries, and propaganda portrayed the B-17 as the weapon that won the air war over Europe. Memphis Belle and other fortresses became symbols of American industrial might and the courage of young airmen who faced death daily while bombing Nazi Germany, and the aircraft's distinctive silhouette, 4 engines, twin tail, bristling with guns, became instantly recognizable as representing American power projection and commitment to defeating tyranny. Post-war air forces worldwide studied B-17 operations to understand strategic bombing's requirements and limitations. The aircraft proved that heavy bombers needed fighter escort, that crew survivability required rugged construction, and that defensive armament alone couldn't guarantee mission success against determined opposition. These lessons influenced B-29, B-36, and B-52 designs that incorporated B-17's survivability principles while adding jet engines, pressurization, and eventually nuclear weapons, creating lineage of strategic bombers that would define American air power for 70 years. Today, only a handful of airworthy B-17s remain, flying in air shows and museums as living history. Veterans who flew them speak of brotherhood forged in combat, terror of flak and fighters, and pride in serving on aircraft that refuse to quit regardless of damage. And modern audiences watching fortress formations fly overhead understand they're witnessing symbols of American determination that absorbed punishment, fought back, and ultimately prevailed through courage and industrial might. The B-17 Flying Fortress earned its name through legendary durability and defensive firepower that broke the Luftwaffe through attrition warfare Germany couldn't sustain. From Schweinfurt's catastrophic losses to Big Week's strategic triumph, the fortress validated daylight bombing doctrine that defined American air power. Thousands of young men paid the ultimate price flying fortresses into German skies. Watch the next video at Vintage Planes for more untold stories.